if you go to Mesoamerica, for example, and examine the legends of the Aztecs or the Mayans or even the Hopi in North America, they all record a conflict, an actual war with the giants. Now, what's really interesting to me, George, is I ran across a scholar. Her name is Adrienne Mayer, and she wrote a series of just wonderful, wonderful books about this very topic. And she points out that in the lore and legends of Mesoamerica, this war against the giants was fought, in their own words, because of the sexual practices of the giants. And I'm thinking, well, my word, that's almost sounding like the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
And, add to that the fact that they are saying that this is a war against giants. That reminds you, of course, and I noticed your website that you put up the Greek version of the war against the giants, the Gigantomachy. So, we have to explain something else here, and that is, why is it that we have the legends of this war against the giants with the Greeks, and then half a world and an ocean away, we find the same legends among completely different cultures with Aztecs and Mayans? So I have to conclude that there's some sort of basis in fact behind all of these things long, long ago in prehistory.
And you look at the Bible, you look at Genesis, and
right.
It talks about the giants it had to have been something, Joseph. It had to have been something.
Well, this is the thing, George. With the Greek version of the story, we're kind of back again to the idea of cosmic war, and this is the reason I put this book in that series as a kind of a sequel to that book, because in the Greek version of this war, you have, of course, Saturn, or Kronos, being the principal god at the beginning of the Greek pantheonic history. And then, of course, Kronos sires a race of giants, and there's a large war. And that war had to have been fought, in my opinion, on an interplanetary basis millennia, if not millions of years ago. So what we're looking at with these legends, I think, all over the world is kind of a vague retelling of something that is so ancient that it kind of got garbled in the transmission. But, I agree. I think you have to look at all these texts, including the Bible, from the standpoint of, critically reassessing what they're saying and comparing notes and details between them. But there's no question in my mind that you're right, that there is some sort of factual basis behind all of these things.
The old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. With these myths, there's got to be some basis behind it.
Absolutely. And this is the real clue that we're dealing with something like this, because over and over again, George, I run into the fact that these completely different cultures that are so disconnected from each other geographically and even culturally to a certain extent, that they are repeating the same details. How do we account for the fact that in the Bible we have stories of giants, we have stories of very strange sexual practices, and then again in an ocean and half a world away we have the same story being told by Aztecs and Mayans?
That's right.
There's just no way that this can be coincidental.
What is the dilemma that you talk about, Delitzsch's?
Delitzsch's dilemma. That's also in Chapter 1 with Professor Koldewey. And Friedrich Delitzsch, just to kind of set this up so that people really understand the full significance of what he actually discovered. Friedrich Delitzsch was one of the world's great Assyriologists. He was fluent in virtually all forms of the languages behind ancient cuneiform. He was very fluent with Sumerian and Akkadian and Assyrian and so on. And Friedrich Delitzsch was, of course, one of these German archaeologists that had spent some time in Mesopotamia digging around and making discoveries. He was called to Berlin to give a private audience on his discoveries to Kaiser Wilhelm II and the imperial court, okay? Right. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because Delitzsch, in this private lecture, recorded and reported on the fact that he had found some cuneiform tablets dating from the time of King Hammurabi, which would be about 1,000 years before the books of Genesis and Exodus were written, if you follow certain conservative datings of those books. And in these cuneiform tablets, he found a version of the Old Testament name of God, Yahweh, clearly present, all right? And word of this leaked out of the Kaiser's court into the public and caused a literal firestorm of controversy, George, all throughout Europe, from Germany to France to England. Everybody was in an uproar at what he had found. And the reason why they were in an uproar, I mean, he had everybody from biblical critics to liberal theologians all mad at him, and that takes a bit of doing to get everybody mad.
Sure does. That's right.
Well, the reason why they were mad at him is, of course, on the one hand, if you were kind of a fundamentalist turn of mind, the name Yahweh is always understood in traditional theology to be a special revelation that God gave to the Hebrews, and then, of course, that tradition was picked up in Christianity. So by saying that this name was nothing special and that it was around 1,000 years before the Hebrews even came along, that was quite shocking enough. But the other problem was that by saying it was 1,000 years older than the first two books of the Bible, he was also saying that all the attempts of the biblical scholars and critics who had been trying to redate the books of the Bible to hundreds of years after the Exodus from Egypt, that this was also wrong. So, yeah, the dilemma that he posed for scholars, and they've never really been able to resolve it ever since, is why is this name present in a Sumerian and Mesopotamian context so very, very early?
You've tied in genetic manipulation with the elitists and many of the things that had gone on in the past. We're coming up to the break, Joseph, but when we come back, I want you to tell us what you think the ancients did in terms of genetic manipulation and what's going on now. We'll be back in a moment. Tell me about your thoughts of genetic engineering from the ancients. What did they do, if anything?
Well, George, this to me is really the big issue because, as you know, from various people that have researched this subject, Zechariah Sitchin and some others, the ancient texts, and I spend a great deal of time in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men talking about a set of tablets, cuneiform tablets called the Karsag tablets that, if you interpret them from a certain point of view, certainly seem to suggest that there is some genetic engineering that took place. And these texts, just to kind of give the details, these texts indicate that there were kind of prototypical proto-human mothers that were selected, and then a member of the Anunnaki, or whatever you wish to call that group of people, that donated the male component, and that essentially that modern humanity is a genetically engineered and created creature. I examined the same legend, and it's certainly found in the Mayan texts, and almost in the same way, all right? So in other words, we're not looking at something that is restricted to Mesopotamian legends. This is something that you also find in the legends and lore of other cultures. And if this be the case, then we're looking at a disturbing thing, because the first thing that these texts, all from the Mayans to the Mesopotamians, state is that mankind was created as a kind of a slave to serve the gods, all right?
Yep.
And this is, number one, the first problem, because in effect what that is saying is that from the ancient point of view, we have, number one, genetic cousins out there somewhere, and number two, we are property, all right? If our cousins were to come back, how would law adjudicate this? Because it is a potential problem. Now, the other thing that the text mentions, George, that's very, very crucial, is that this is a wholesale program. This is not just the engineering or the manipulation of human DNA. This is something that they're doing across the board with all sorts of species. There's an ancient Babylonian historian by the name of Berosus, and he's even cited and quoted in many of the early church fathers. And Berosus maintains in his text that not only do you have an engineering of mankind, but you have the engineering of very chimerical species of blending humanity with animals and so on and so forth. So in other words, what we're looking at, George, with modern science, and I find this to be equally disturbing, we are looking really at a science that seems to be designed, in my opinion, to bring to reality the mythological creations of the past. So in other words, again, that raises the bar considerably, because what it's implying is that these ancient texts are, in fact, talking about a reality that happened. So, it's a very complex question, because we are dealing today, in other words, with the same sorts of ethical problems that were being dealt with in very, very ancient times in the midst of prehistory. And that's the problem.
Now, as civilizations began to evolve over the years, they seem to have lost this knowledge until here we are today. What happened in between?
To me, George, I think, again, all of this is arguing that you're looking at the activity of at least one elite, if not more, that has been in more or less continual existence since ancient times. And again, the behavior of all elites throughout history is to try and preserve knowledge for themselves and leak as much of it as they dare to the public to maintain their own power. I think this is what's going on. And I think certainly you could argue a case. I certainly do not advance it as a dogmatic case, but only as a speculative possibility. I think you could advance the possibility that many of the ancient systems of belief were created simply to mask the activity of this elite, to disguise it, as it were, behind religion, behind mystery schools, behind temples and priesthoods and so on. And I certainly suggest that in the book.
Well, I was going to say, do you think the gods of ancient times were simply visitors, or, primarily visitors?
I incline to that view, George, and here's why. If you look at these ancient texts, for the most part, they are describing people. They are describing conscious beings with emotions, with feelings, with agendas, and like all intelligent beings, they fight and argue amongst themselves and so on and so forth. That said, I do think that you have to hold open the possibility as well that many of these ancient legends are telling the truth when they say that these beings are, to some degree, spiritual beings as well. They come from, if you will, other dimensions. They might be angels, they might be demons, and so on and so forth. So I think, to kind of sum it up, that you're really looking at three classes of things. You're looking at genetic cousins, in other words, human-like beings with whom we share some genetic compatibility that makes all this engineering possible. And then secondly, I think you're looking at deeper possible entities, that you're looking at gods in the proper sense. You're looking at angels or what have you, because some of these beings can't be classified, if you examine the text carefully, as corporeal beings like we are. So I think you have to hold open all possibilities.
Joseph, last hour we're talking about civilizations that could be hundreds of millions of years older than most people think.
Uh-huh.
And could they have then possessed technology which would have allowed them to do some of these incredible things we've been talking about? But then they got obliterated. Some calamity. Something happened to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the whole premise here that I've been following, George, is that the calamity, in my opinion, was an actual war that decimated that society. In other words, I'm not in the catastrophist school. I don't think it was natural causes as much as it was deliberate action of a society that had possession of extremely sophisticated technology and extremely destructive weaponry. But that said, one of the things that before the break that you asked was really a great question, and it's very important to the subject of genes, giants, monsters, and men. In fact, I spend the last chapter of the book trying to figure out how do you harmonize the findings of researchers like Cremo that have indicated from archaeology that there are artifacts of intelligent beings that were here long, long before any recorded history begins. In some cases we're dealing with artifacts that are millions of years old. So this is long, long before mankind himself in his modern form is even on the scene. Geneticists think that modern Homo sapiens sapiens was around for, 150 to 200,000 years ago, somewhere in that range. So if we're looking at artifacts that are millions of years ago, we're looking at two things, exactly as you say. We're looking at a sophisticated culture, we're looking at a sophisticated technology, and we're also looking at human beings that are somehow, in my opinion, and this is the way I attempt to resolve this, we're looking at the remains or the legacies or the monuments of our genetic cousins that were here before we were. So I think, I think we're looking at a very huge story. We've got cousins out there. They may still be out there. And, one branch of the family is here, and they came here and kind of kickstarted us into existence.
And is it possible that we did not have ET visitation? I think we did, but is it possible we didn't? Merely we had ancient ancestors on this planet.
Well, I think both, George. That's an excellent question. And my model of thinking about it is probably very similar to yours, especially after doing this particular book. That if we're going to talk about ancient extraterrestrial contact, and I think there's abundant evidence that something of that nature did occur, then I think what we're looking at in terms of that contact is precisely some branch of the human genus, some branch of the human family that came here and discovered an evolutionary process underway and like I said, tried to kind of kickstart it and give it a jump and basically engineered humanity into existence. We have to hold open that possibility, again, because we are dealing with legends of that sort and the details managed to dovetail. In fact, let's mention one thing that's very significant in that regard, George.
Okay.
If we look at the legends of the Mayans and the Aztecs that my friend Scott and I examine in The Grid of the Gods, one of the things that struck us as very, very strange is that in the Aztec doctrine, for example, you have the idea of 5 different ages, or what they call 5 suns, all right? And one of the peculiar things that they connect that doctrine to, just as do the Mayans, is that in each age there is a different humanity, all right? Now, many people leap on that and say, well, that's just kind of a proto-theosophical doctrine. I don't think that's what they're talking about, because if you read their texts, what they're talking about are continued manipulations of the human species by somebody in each of these ages. And if that's the case, then, you're dealing either with manipulation or they have a very good handle on evolutionary theory.
Yeah.
But either way you look at it, George, you're dealing with people that have a very sophisticated view, and that view in turn implies that at some point they had a sophisticated scientific background long ago that led to those views.
So let's jumpstart it and come up to where we are today.
Okay.
How much more have we learned than what you think we knew a long time ago?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful question. I think based on the research I did in Genes and Giants, that we are getting, George, to the point that we used to be. And the reason I say that is twofold. If you look at the implied science in some of these ancient texts, it's of a twofold nature. You're dealing with a very sophisticated biological science. You're dealing with a very sophisticated ability to do genetic engineering that we are just now beginning to be able to do. In other words, we are now, George, engineering chimerical creatures, creations that are half human, half animal, and so on and so forth. We've engineered cats that glow in the dark and all sorts of bizarre things. So we are looking at our return to the level of science implied by those ancient texts in terms of biology. And then the second thing I think that we are looking at, and again, and this is such an excellent, important question, is that if you read those ancient texts, they imply also an extremely sophisticated physics. And I think that, again, if you look at modern accomplishments in physics, if you look at modern accomplishments in engineering with nanotechnology, we're beginning to crack the codes of quantum computing and so on and so forth. All of this, I think, indicates that we are, again, returning to the state of development that we had in those mists of prehistory. So I think we're on the cusp of the very same type of civilization.
Let's get some of your let's get your take, Joseph, on the FBI releasing the Vault. A memo, an incredible memo about what I think was Roswell, New Mexico, maybe also other areas where they talked about 3 crashed craft, alien bodies. What do you think's going on here? I mean, you've looked at this through a lot of your work over the years.
Yes.
What's happening?
Well, George, the only way I can rationalize it, and again, it's an excellent question, and I'm at this juncture kind of unsettled about it. I must be quite honest. And the reason why is I think you could be looking at, on the one hand, a controlled release of information. In other words, someone wants this out at this time. And I think the reason that they may want it out at this time is I'm kind of in agreement with Richard Hoagland here. I think that we've been looking at a kind of a covert war that's been taking place not only here on Earth but up above in outer space. And I think to a certain extent we may be looking at a possible release of information by elites that want us to know these things. I mean, my word, George, they've also released the fact and verified the fact now that memorandum of President Kennedy ordering the CIA to release all this information to NASA concerning UFOs is more or less a true memorandum. And I've talked about that memorandum in some of my books. I know that Richard has in some of his, and many others have as well. And I have always believed that it was, in fact, genuine. And now they're releasing information that tells us basically that it was. So, I have to conclude that these elites, George, for some reason, they're preparing us for something, is what it boils down to. I think they're preparing us for some sort of process of increasing gradual leaks. I'm not on the disclosure bandwagon. I don't think that they're ever going to come right out in a big, beautiful, magical day of revelation, but I do think that they are leaking these things because, again, like I say, the technology, George, that we're reaching is so reminiscent of the civilization and culture that was described in these ancient texts, and I think that these elites have to be thinking that they may be in contact with some of these genetic cousins, and we'd better get ready.
Well, I think so, too. Was there anything unsettling about your research when you were putting genes, giants, monsters, and men together?
Oh, my word, yes. Yes, there was. It wasn't even any one specific thing, George. One of the most unsettling things to me was this constant feeling I kept getting as I was researching all the archaeological data, not only with Cremo and Thompson and some of the things that they've uncovered, but some things that other archaeologists, I've mentioned Adrian Mayer and other archaeologists have uncovered in this country. I kept getting the distinct feeling, George, again, that we were looking at a massive cover-up or reluctance to talk about, let's put it that way, a reluctance to talk about these things on the part of standard archaeology. And again, if you aren't willing to talk about these things, that means there's something about them that has to be unsettling to the professional academic. And again, I think all of it is due to the fact that we are dealing with clear evidence not only of a very ancient, sophisticated civilization, but that it had some sort of interplanetary extent. And the implication, therefore, is, once again, that we may have members of the human family out there. And if that's the case, then, they may be coming back. And that ties into the other big unsettling thing that I mentioned in the first hour, is if these stories, and it's a mighty big if, let's admit, but if these stories, George, are true, that we are engineered into existence by a group of people with an agenda, then this means we're property. So if they're coming back, the implication is they might be coming back to claim their property.
Sure.
And the problem here, George, is now humanity, as I've indicated, has the technology to fight back. So, it's a pretty nasty scenario that emerges from all of this, and that probably was the most unsettling thing that I found.